Hi, Tony Northrup here for TrainSignal, and in this video lesson we're going to learn how to configure remote management on Windows 8. This should be a quick and fun lesson. This lesson maps to Objective 3.4 of the Microsoft 70-687 certification exam. This objective has 3 sub-objectives: choose the appropriate management tools, configure remote management settings, and modify settings remotely by using MMCs or Windows PowerShell. The approach I'm going to take to teach these is to demonstrate the different methods of remote management. So we're going to configure a computer for remote desktop and then connect to it. Then we're going to initiate a remote assistance session and answer it, which allows you to help somebody remotely. We're then going to connect to a remote computer and manage it using the MMC tools, which are the tools like the Services Console and the Computer Management Console. And finally, we're going to fire up a PowerShell console and use it to run command line commands on a remote computer. It's a great way to run scripts over the network. Let's get started by using remote desktop. Here is a Windows 8 Pro computer. I'm going to be using 2 different computers here because we're going to be connecting between them. The first thing you'll want to do is on the computer that you're connecting to, this is going to be the remote desktop server, we're going to go to the desktop. Then we need to edit the computer properties, and I find the easiest way to do that is to open up Explorer, right-click the computer, and then click Properties. From here, click Advanced System Settings. On the System Properties dialog, we'll go to the Remote tab, and you'll see the Remote Desktop group here. By default, Don't Allow Remote Connections to this computer is selected, and you can guess what that does. It doesn't allow remote connections. So we want to select Allow Remote Connections to this computer, and that will allow incoming remote desktop connections. This does a couple of things. It starts up the remote desktop service, and it configures the firewall to allow the incoming connections on private and domain networks, not on public networks. Now, there's a configuration option here. Allow connections only from computers running remote desktop with network level authentication. And that couldn't be a wordier way to say require some advanced security. Basically, when this checkbox is selected, it requires the client computer that's connecting to this computer to have a more recent version of remote desktop. Some older versions of remote desktop didn't really perform adequate authentication, and as a result, they were vulnerable to some security weaknesses. It's selected by default, and as long as you don't try to connect from an older version of remote desktop or you're not using a third-party remote desktop service, you can leave it selected. I'll say I have a remote desktop client that I use on my iPad and iPhone, and they don't support this, so when I want to connect from one of those devices, I have to uncheck it. My advice: try to connect with whatever client you have with this selected, and if it works, you're golden. And if it doesn't work, go back, clear that checkbox, and try it again. But for now, we'll just leave that selected. You'll see there's another option here to select users. This is only if you want to add users who are not a member of the administrators group. All administrators already get access to remote desktop, but if there's a standard user and you want them to be able to connect to their computer, just click Add and specify their name. Now, while I'm here, I'm going to show you the remote assistance checkbox. You can see that the remote assistance checkbox is already enabled. So you don't necessarily need to do anything extra to have remote assistance turned on. You might want to turn it off, but I don't feel like leaving remote assistance enabled introduces any great security risks. Remote assistance has to be initiated on the computer that you're connecting to. It has to be specifically approved by the user, so you can generally leave it selected and not worry about too much. So remote desktop is now turned on this computer. So once you've turned it on the computer you're connecting to, you can go to a different computer and launch the remote desktop client. I'll search the start screen for it. And here you can see remote desktop connection. Now, by default, you're prompted just to put in the computer name and click connect. And the default settings are often enough, but let's take a look at the options really quick. When you connect, it will prompt you for the credentials if you haven't typed anything, so you don't have to worry about that too much. If you connect regularly to the same computer, you probably want to check this checkbox so that it will save the credentials and you don't have to type your username and password every time, because if you're like me, you're probably sick of typing your username and password all the time, every website you visit, right? So I like to save the credentials, but in an IT environment where you're helping users on different computers on a regular basis, you'd probably want to leave that cleared. The display option here allows you to control the size of the window. You can go full screen, in which case it's really immersive. You really feel like you're sitting at the computer. You can also choose to use a smaller window. This computer only has a single monitor, but if you have a multi-monitor display like I do on my desktop, then you can actually connect to a computer and use both of your monitors or all of your monitors if you have more than two. It's pretty cool. You can be connecting to a little tiny laptop computer that only has one screen and still pull it up on two monitors. The color depth just controls how many different colors can be displayed on the screen. Nowadays, we're pretty much used to 32-bit color. You probably won't notice 15-bit color if you wanted to save a little bit of bandwidth on a LAN. It doesn't really matter, and everything's compressed anyway. So I generally leave that at the default setting here. Now, when you are in full screen, and we'll see this in just a second when I demonstrate it, but it'll show a little connection bar at the top. That connection bar just allows you to get out of remote desktop. The local resources tab is useful to configure. The default settings are good for most people. What local resources does is it takes things that would normally be intercepted by the local computer and it sends them off to the remote computer. So if I'm on my laptop and I'm connecting remotely to my desktop, if I press Control-Delete, the local computer is going to intercept that and show Task Manager on my local computer. And Control-Alt-Delete actually can't be changed, but the other Windows combinations, things like Alt-Tab, which switches between applications, can be configured to be processed by the local computer, the remote computer, or the remote computer when you're using full screen. So you can see by default, if you're not in full screen mode, Alt-Tab would switch to another app on the local computer. And if you're in full screen mode, you can press Alt-Tab and it will be processed by the remote computer. The default setting is good here because when you're in full screen, you're immersed and you forget that you even are using a local computer. But when it's windowed, you think about it more readily. You can see that you also have the option to share your clipboard. So you can copy some text from your local computer and then paste it into a window on the remote computer. Terribly useful. And you can also share printers. Sharing printers is important because imagine that I'm traveling with my laptop and I connect across the internet to the desktop computer at home. And then I'm working on my desktop computer and I go to print something. Do you think I want to print it at my home, which is miles and miles away, or do I want to print it to a local printer? Well, of course you want to print it locally. So what this does is it automatically shares the printers that I have on my local computer with the remote computer. So imagine this scenario. I need to print a document that I have on my desktop computer. When I leave this option selected, the printer that I have connected to my laptop computer locally will show up as an option on my desktop computer, allowing me to print to the printer right next to me, even though everything is going back and forth across the internet. You can see if you click the More button, you get a couple more options. You get the chance to share ports, which are like serial ports, which nobody uses anymore. That's why it's not selected by default. You also get the chance to share drives. Now, this is useful. If I have a file on my local laptop and I want to edit it in an app like Word on my remote desktop, if I select this checkbox, I can go through and browse the files and folders on my local computer from my remote computer. Some devices, some plug-and-play USB devices can also be shared, but not all of them. By default, when a sound happens on your remote computer, it's sent back to your local computer. So if you play an MP3 or listen to a video on your remote computer, you'll see it across the remote desktop connection. Rather, you'll hear it. Now, this works out pretty well because it does a pretty good job of compressing all this stuff. If you actually wanted to play the music on your remote computer, I don't know why I'd want to start a video across a remote desktop connection and then have people in the room with my remote computer hear it. But you would select the Play on Remote Computer option. You could also simply silence it if you didn't want any sounds to happen. If you have a mic, you can also record from a mic connected to your local computer to an app running on the remote computer. The Programs tab simply lets you automatically start an app whenever you connect to the PC. And honestly, I can't even think of a scenario where you'd want that to happen. But if you always fire up an app after launching remote desktop, then I guess you could configure that there. The Experience tab basically makes all of this easier to configure. So things like the color depth can be configured automatically. And you'll see there are a lot of different options here that can be configured. Now, the latest version of Remote Desktop is pretty smart. It'll figure out how fast your connection is. It kind of tests it when it's authenticating you. And if it's a high-speed connection, it turns on all your fancy menus and the shadows behind things. Well, there's not a lot of that, but for example, in this drop list, you can see this little shadow back here. If I were to select the modem connection, you wouldn't see that shadow. It would actually be a very basic display. With low bandwidth connections, this can really improve the performance. You can also manually select different options. Each one of these requires a little bit more bandwidth. It slows the performance down a little bit. I think with a high-speed LAN connection or even a broadband connection across the internet, you can leave all of them selected, get the best user interface experience possible, and there's no problems at all. This is especially true with Windows 8 and its beautifully simple user interface. If you think back to Windows XP and Windows 7 with their fancy arrow interfaces, Remote Desktop will channel all of that arrow stuff, the like translucent glass. It takes a lot more bandwidth, but Windows 8 is so simple that you can pretty much leave all of these experiences enabled. There are a couple of options down here. Persistent bitmap caching just caches some stuff locally and speed things up, and then this reconnects automatically if you lose your connection. I leave both of those selected generally. Server authentication is important to understand. First, we need to talk about how this could be exploited by an attacker. Imagine that in the course of your job, you need to connect to a domain controller and configure some settings. Now, when you connect to the domain controller, you might be prompted to type in your username and password, and you don't worry about it because it's your own server, right? Well, if there's a clever hacker, what they could do is they could set up a fake server, somehow channel your internet traffic away from the legitimate server and to their fake server. Then when you connected to your server, you'd be connecting to their fake server, and they could prompt you for your username and password, and then they'd have your credentials. Server authentication makes that much, much less likely because every server has a certificate on it. Now, you see three different options here. One is to connect even if server authentication fails. Another is to warn you that server authentication failed. And the third is to simply not connect. If you go into group policy, you'll see you can force this on your users to take away the option to do this. Server authentication tends to fail for no good reason regularly. It will simply say the certificate is not trusted or the certificate's name is wrong, something like that. So I always leave it as warn me. Frankly, there are so many failures that it's frustrating if you said do not connect because you wouldn't be able to connect very often, even when the server hasn't been compromised. There's a server app called Remote Desktop Gateway. So the way Remote Desktop works is you establish a client to server connection. And anytime you connect to a server on the internet, it needs to have a unique IP address and port number. These are the house and street number of the destination, basically. So it uniquely identifies Remote Desktop on a particular computer on the internet. Here's the catch. Most enterprises use a technology called network address translation. And network address translation takes a single public IP address, that's a single address on the internet, and uses it for hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of different computers. So I just told you that you need a unique IP address for every computer that you connect to. So how can you do that when you have only one IP address but thousands of computers that you'd want to access? Well, Remote Desktop Gateway is the solution to that. With Remote Desktop Gateway, you connect to that one public IP address, and then it forwards your traffic to the computer you're actually trying to get to. It's literally a gateway. Now, Remote Desktop, the app here, will pretty much always work out the gateway based on the settings, but if your organization sets up a remote desktop gateway and they tell you how to configure it, well, you might have to go in here and match these settings to it. You can see that you can have multiple different gateway servers, and they might tell you, well, you need to specify this particular gateway server. This checkbox is particularly important. If you end up specifying a remote desktop gateway server, which will have a particular name, imagine that you're connecting to a computer that's right across the hallway from you. You don't want to go through your remote desktop gateway server to get to another computer on the same LAN. That would be a waste of traffic, and it would add extra latency as the communications went to the gateway server and then back to that computer. So leave this checkbox selected, and it just goes directly to computers that are on your local network. And if you never use a remote desktop gateway server, you can select this, but automatically detect remote desktop gateway server settings will basically figure out that you're not using that and do that anyway. So you don't necessarily ever need to change that. So with our settings configured, one thing I find useful when I'm connecting to the same computer over and over again is to save my settings. So I'll just click save here to save it. It writes an RDP file that you can access later and automatically connect to a computer with a single click. So I'll hide these options to show you your more typical experience. Here I've typed the name of another computer on the local network, and I'll connect to it now. And you're going to see a lot of these types of warnings. This warning is appearing because I decided to share some additional resources. And what it's saying is, if I end up connecting to a malicious computer, well, I'm sharing my drives with it. So that computer could potentially write some malware to my drives and do something bad. I've got audio recording on, so it could listen to whatever I'm saying in the local room. Anyway, if you do these things, you want to make sure that the computer hasn't been hacked by malware. If you haven't connected before, or you have connected and you chose not to save your credentials, it's going to prompt you for a username and password. By default, it'll use your local username and you'll just have to retype your password. If you use a different username for the remote computer, you'll select use another account and type it there. And as I was talking about server authentication and the unnecessary warnings that you get sometimes, this is a good example of that. It can't identify the server. And the reason is that the certificate is not from a trusted certifying authority. I configured remote desktop on the remote computer, but they're not a member of the same domain. If they were, this error wouldn't appear. The remote computer is just a personal computer, so it's not a member of any domain. Sometimes you'll also see an error saying that the name doesn't match up. If you type a name that's even slightly different than the name that the remote computer thinks its name is, like if you type in the IP address or you type in contoso.com instead of contoso.net, even if they point to the same place, if the name doesn't match, you'll get a warning. So to skip this in the future, I'll select Don't Ask Me Again, and I'll click Yes to connect despite its warning. And here I am on my remote computer. You can see it picked up where I left off in the last desktop session. At the top here, you see the toolbar, and it provides a little bit of information. In full screen mode, you have the option of seeing this particular toolbar. I'll restore it down so you can see the remote desktop in a window. This little icon here is useful. It just pins it. You see when I unpin it and move my cursor away from the top, it'll disappear. To get it back, just go back up to the top, and you can pin it again if you want to keep it up there for constant reference. This indicates your connection speed. Looks a lot like those bars on your cell phone for a good reason. It's telling you how strong the signal is, basically. The more bars you have here, the faster it is and the better a experience it's going to give you. The more of those fancy user interface elements like shadowing and such that it's going to show. If those bars start to drop, you'll notice the color will get a little blockier and you might lose your desktop background. Remote desktop automatically scales the experience down based on the performance that you have, at least by default. Now this drop list here is a new feature in Windows 8, and it gives you access to some things which are rather difficult to access in Windows 8 if you don't have a touch screen. Now, for example, if there's no way for me to, if I can't properly swipe in from the side and I don't have access to the keyboard, I might have a hard time accessing the Charms bar. So I can hit this drop list here and then click Charms, and look, it pops right up. Now, of course, I could also do that by holding down the Windows key and pressing C. So there's also always another way to do it, but it's useful to know that these remote commands are here. Now, as you recall earlier, I told it to send remote keystrokes like Alt-Tab to the remote PC. So as I press Alt-Tab here, you can see I'm actually Alt-Tabbing on the remote computer. I'll window this down and press Alt-Tab. And this is on my local computer. This app, as you recall, was something I opened up on the local computer. And that's about all you need to know about remote desktop. I find it tremendously useful. I use it all the time in IT environments. They use it to manage remote computers. But even in your personal life, it's great to be able to grab a laptop and then connect to your desktop and run a really heavy app. For example, I am also a photographer, so I use Photoshop and Lightroom, but my little laptop doesn't really have the horsepower to run these big apps. So what I'll do is I'll take my laptop and I'll go sit on the couch and I remote desktop into my big, powerful desktop computer where I can run them. And I use all the desktop's processing power, and all my laptop has to do is run this, what they call a thin client. So it's really just acting like a display with a keyboard and mouse, and the desktop computer is doing all of the heavy processing. Now let's talk about remote assistance. Remote assistance is remote desktop, except somebody can create an invitation, and when you receive that invitation, it allows you to connect to their computer. It can also work the other way around. You can create an invitation to help somebody, send them the invite, and then when they click a link and confirm the security risks, you'll be able to connect to their computer. So this happens a lot in my personal life. I'll have a friend who's having a problem with the computer, and they'll be like, I don't know, I click this and that and it does this and that, and I'll just say, this would be so much easier if I could just sit at your computer. You're far away. Why don't you open up remote assistance and send me an invite? Then I'll be able to sit at your computer and control it and see with my own eyes what's going on. In IT environments, the exact same thing happens. Somebody will call the support desk and the support guy won't want to walk them click by click through everything. So they'll just connect using remote assistance and basically drive their computer across the network. Sounds scary to let somebody else into your computer, and indeed bad things can happen, but the client, the one being helped at their own local computer, ultimately they have a great deal of control and they can end the assistance anytime they want. So let's talk about how to create a remote assistance invitation. From the start screen, I find it easiest just to search for assistance. It's located under the settings, and you'll see a couple of different options here. We verified earlier that the checkbox to allow remote assistance is already selected. It's selected by default, so we don't have to worry about these first two items. This is the option that we want: invite someone to connect to your PC and help you, or offer help to somebody else. This is very wizard based, and it really couldn't be easier. Here, the remote assistance wizard pops up and just asks if you want to have somebody help you or you want to help somebody else. So for now, we'll pretend that we need help. So before you can connect over the network with remote assistance, you need a couple of pieces of information. You need permission from them, and you need to be able to locate their computer on the network. And in the past, these could be quite hard to work out, but Microsoft has developed something called EasyConnect that makes it very simple. Before we go forward with EasyConnect, I want to show you a couple of other options. If the person is having a hard time with EasyConnect, it won't work for everybody, you can save the invitation as a file. Then as long as they can get that file to you, you'll be able to open the link. Now, that means they could send it in Instant Messenger, they could put it on Facebook, anything that can transfer a file and you can receive it will work for them. You can also send the invitation in email. I haven't set up email on this computer, which is why that's grayed out. So let's go forward with EasyConnect. Now, EasyConnect gives me this 12-digit password, and this password uniquely identifies this computer on the internet and gives the recipient access to connect to it. So now I'll take that 12-digit password and type it into a different PC, and we'll connect back to this computer. You might recognize this computer. This time, this computer is going to be the client, and we're going to connect over to our other computer. I'm going to repeat that process of opening up remote assistance. This time we're going to be the helper. Okay, this is something that happens regularly in the real world. EasyConnect doesn't always work. I'll tell you what would happen if EasyConnect were working here. I would just click use EasyConnect, type in those 12 digits, and it would connect. But we use this opportunity to instead open an invitation file. So I'll copy that file over now, and then we can open it up. So back at the PC that needs help, I'll save the invitation as a file. You can see it comes up with a MSRC incident file. That's the remote assistant invitation file. So I'll just save that to the documents and then copy it over to the remote PC. In the real world, you'd probably send it in an email. And here we are on our helper PC. You can see I've copied over the invitation file. So I'll double click it now. And now I need to type in that password. You can see down here it says waiting for acceptance. So once again, we'll flip back to the other PC. And you can see it's prompting me, would you like to allow Tony Northrup to connect to the computer? Every step of the way, it confirms that you want this to happen, and that helps to minimize the security risk. So if this were to get hacked, it would still pop up this window out of the middle of nowhere, and chances are good if you didn't want help, you'd click no. I do want help. So this is on the computer being helped, and you can see here it says your helper can now see your desktop. This gives you the option to chat with the person. And you can even pause the connection, which stops them from being able to see your screen. You could do that if you needed to take care of something and you didn't want to share it. We'll take a look at the settings really quickly. You can see that by default, using the escape key to stop sharing control isn't enabled. Escape is a pretty common key, so you wouldn't want to press that accidentally. It does save a log of the session, and more importantly, there's a slider here for bandwidth usage. This helps to optimize the performance. Unlike Remote Desktop, which handles all this automatically, Remote Assistance doesn't. It just starts out with the lowest possible bandwidth usage to provide you the best performance possible. But since you really are just using it to get something done and help somebody out, you usually don't care if font smoothing is on or you have a pretty background. So the default setting is generally fine there. So let's jump over to the helper computer. And here we go. So this is the window. You can see it's been compressed down a little bit. The chat log is over there. And I can watch what they're doing, but by default, I can't take control of their desktop. Once again, we need more authentication to allow this to happen. So if you had them on the phone, you could say, hey, click the Internet Explorer icon in the bottom. If I want to take control and it makes things easier, I'll click the request control button up here. And once again, it gets prompted. I can't do that from here. So I'll switch over to the other computer and click yes. Now, you'll notice this prompt here, allow the helper to respond to user account control prompts. If you're not familiar with it, user account control, commonly known as UAC, separates your day-to-day user privileges from the administrative privileges required to make changes to the computer. Before you make any change that might install software or install malware or do something else important on the computer, UAC pops up and says, are you sure you want to do that? It can be annoying. It can also save you from getting bad stuff done to your computer. Now, if you totally trust the person, select that. Once you do that, it's going to bypass UAC. They could potentially install some malware. So if you do that, make sure you trust them. If you don't select the checkbox, UAC prompts will still appear on your local computer. So you can continue on with configuration, but you'll have to be sitting there confirming UAC whenever it pops up. You can see here it tells me Tony Northrup is sharing control of the computer. I'll pop over to the helping PC just to verify that we can do stuff. All right. So you can see it all works. Now, notice that the experience is a little bit lower. Normally when you drag a window, the whole window moves, but it's just showing the outline. That's the result of the bandwidth optimizations that Remote Assistance is making. If you were to use Remote Desktop with some of the visual features disabled, you'd have a similar experience. As you can see, it gets everything done. It's just not quite as pretty. I will point out the actual size button here. This just stops the compression, so now I'm forced to scroll around in the window. If you have a bigger monitor than they do, it's not an issue. And that's basically all there is to remote assistance. Now let's move on to something really easy, and that's managing a remote PC with MMCs. And MMC is the Microsoft Management Console tool, and it's what they call all the different tools like the Services Console and the Computer Management Console. It's just their standardized way of providing admin tools. And because it's standardized, they make it really easy to run all of them on a remote PC. So imagine this scenario with me. Your boss asks you to troubleshoot a problem for a user that's called in. They can't print. And he talked to them already and he knows the problem is that the printer spooler service hasn't started. So all you need to do is connect to their PC and start up the printer spooler service. So let's work through that scenario right now. So here we are at our Windows 8 computer. The first thing you'll do is you'll open up the console that you'll want to use to manage the remote computer. You can open up the administrative tools group to access the different applications. You'll see a bunch of different tools here. These used to be part of the start menu and now they're kind of hidden away. The Computer Management Console is the one I use for everything. It's got all the other consoles built into it. So as you see, we can browse through here and select different items. And by default, it browses your local computer. If you want to access a remote PC, it's really easy. I'll just right-click Computer Management and then select Connect to another computer. Now I'll type the name of the remote computer and press OK. On a domain, this will happen automatically and you'll be authenticated. Now you need administrative credentials to the remote PC. Now that I'm connected, I can scroll down, find that print spooler service and start it up. Well, it's already running on this particular computer. We'll stop it and restart it. And hopefully that solves the problem. I'm going to quickly show you a firewall rule that needs to be set up. Now, it's generally set up by default, so you might not have to change anything. But if things don't work, it's a good place to look under the advanced firewall settings here. We're going to look at the inbound rules, and we'll scroll down to the remote event log management group. So here you can see several rules which on this local computer aren't enabled. You need to enable the remote event log management rules, as well as the remote service management tools. Without those rules enabled, Windows Firewall will intercept the management requests and block them. As you can imagine, that's a pretty powerful thing, so you don't really want people doing that all the time. That's why those rules are disabled by default. So you should use group policy settings to enable those rules for all the computers in your organization. Now, remote management with PowerShell is unbelievably powerful. You can do anything on the computer totally automatically, and as a result, it's disabled by default. One of the things enterprises do when they set up a new Windows 8 client is to configure it for remote management, at least by their authorized users. So let's go through the steps to configure remote management on a client. This is going to be the remote computer that you'll be managing. There are a few different steps you can go through. The first for me is usually to open up an administrative command prompt. I'll use the WinX menu here. And then run the command winrm quick config. This will start the Windows Remote Management Service and set it to start automatically. It will also configure the firewalls to allow those incoming connections. So you'll have to confirm both of those changes. And it takes effect immediately. As you can see here, the startup type changed to automatic, and it also started the service for us, then enabled the firewall rules down here. So we should be configured to allow remote connections. Let's do a couple of things in PowerShell. PowerShell is this unbelievably powerful command line management and scripting interface. From the start menu, I'll type PowerShell. It's built into Windows 8 for the first time, which is really cool. When you're using PowerShell for management, you pretty much always run it as an administrator. It doesn't happen by default though, so you have to make a point of right-clicking on it. Now, if you haven't worked with scripting environments before, The way scripting works is you can type in a series of commands that you would run at a command prompt and save them in a file and then run them all automatically. And administrators do it all the time to automate monotonous tasks. It's also very useful for managing remote computers and even many different remote computers at a time. We're not going to be changing any remote computers just yet. We're going to still be configuring this particular computer. So the first commandlet that I'll run is git service winrm. In PowerShell, they call these tools commandlets. And this just verifies that the Windows Remote Management Service is running, as you can see. That means that incoming connections are allowed. Basically, the computer's listening for it. That service is running only because we just ran the winrm quick config command. Now, to configure Windows PowerShell on this computer for remoting, I'm going to run another command, and that's enable PS remoting, and then use the force parameter. And this commandlet checks all the many different things that are required to allow incoming connections. And you can see based on the output that it's already set up to receive remote requests and allowed remote management. Now we can start to run some PowerShell commands on the remote computer. So here we're at the Windows Server 2012 computer, which in this example is going to work exactly like a Windows 8 computer. And I'll launch the PowerShell tool, again with administrative privileges. The first thing we can do is make sure that our connection to the remote computer is going to work. So you can use the test connection commandlet for this. I run test connection and then the name of the PC, which is Windows 8 Enterprise, Win8Ent. That looks a lot like a ping command, right? It just went to the PC and made sure that it could communicate okay. Now what we'll do is we'll open up a remote PowerShell connection to it. The commandlet for that is enter-ps session. That's PowerShell session, and then the name of the PC. And as you can see from this prefix here, all of my commands are now going to be run on the remote computer as if I were sitting directly on the console. Now I could launch scripts or run any command that I wanted to, all from this command prompt. I have total and complete administrative control, at least as much as my administrator's credentials will allow me to do. So let's check on that print spooler service and see if it's running. For that, I want to run the git service spooler command. Spooler is the short name of the print spooler service. And we can see here that the service is indeed stopped. To start it up, I'll run the start service spooler command. It didn't give me any feedback, which it would have if it were an error. So I'll run git service once again, and we can see it's running. Two different ways to do exactly the same thing. Now I've just scratched the surface of PowerShell. It's an immense tool that people dedicate their whole professional careers to mastering, and the certification exam isn't going to make sure that you know any PowerShell commands, including these really basic commands that I showed you, but you should know how to configure computers to accept remote connections. Remember that winrm quick config command, and make sure that the remote management service is up and running. It wouldn't hurt to know that you can run the enter ps session command to connect to a remote computer and then run any services that you need. I also want to show you one other command that's really, really cool. It's called invoke command. And the way you use it is you specify a computer name. And the amazing thing here is you can specify a list of computer names. Then you can specify the command that you want to run on all of them in curly brackets. So here I might start the spooler service on all of these computers all at once. Now, this is just an example, but if I were to run this command and those computers existed and they were all configured for remote management and my account had appropriate privileges, this one command would start the spooler service on all those 4 computers. Just imagine the power of this in an organization with thousands and thousands of computers. They'd all be at your fingertips, whatever you wanted to happen instantly in any number. Remote management is extremely powerful and extremely exciting, and it can save you so much time and just make your job really easy. This is Tony Northrup for TrainSignal, and I hope you found the lesson both educational and enjoyable, and I'll see you next time.